What happened on Capitol Hill wasn't partisan sniping. It was the rare moment when elected Democrats spoke about a war the way the public actually experiences it, as a real-world catastrophe, with names, bodies, coffins, and consequences that don't care about cable news framing. And what made the scene feel so raw is that it wasn't an abstract policy disagreement. It was members of Congress looking straight at the wreckage and saying out loud that Donald Trump dragged the country into an unnecessary, reckless conflict, and then performed the oldest con in the book, turning the suffering into a campaign prop while pretending the chaos is going beautifully. Listen to the through line of what these Democrats are saying, and you can hear the indictment forming without anyone having to announce it as such. They're describing a leadership style that can't be separated from the outcome. Humiliation abroad, isolation from allies, an administration that cannot explain its own strategy, and a president so consumed by spectacle and self-enrichment that he treats war like a branding opportunity. When Ryan calls the administration's behavior an SNL skit that isn't funny because people are dying, he's not reaching for a clever line. He's pointing at a familiar Trump pattern. Chaos as governance, recklessness as performance, and accountability treated as an insult instead of a constitutional necessity. Then comes the focus on Pete Hegseth, because in this story, he's not just a personality, he's a symptom. Multiple members describe him as out of his depth, unable to answer detailed questions, incapable of articulating a coherent operational picture, reduced to reading scripts and blustering louder when reality bites back. You can feel the disgust in the way they talk about it, and not because they're allergic to conservative ideology. It's because the stakes are national security and human life, and the administration is presenting itself like an amateur improv troupe that wandered into the Pentagon. When lawmakers describe watching him in classified briefings and feeling embarrassment for the United States, that is not normal politics. That's a warning flare. But the deeper charge is about process. Because process is how democracies keep presidents from treating war like a personal hobby. Again and again, they point to what wasn't done. Allies weren't consulted, the public wasn't informed, Congress wasn't meaningfully engaged, and the administration seems to have assumed it could insult NATO for years and then snap its fingers for support once the consequences arrived. There's a reason that critique lands. Alliances aren't vending machines. You don't spend years degrading partners, dismissing their concerns, and treating international commitments like a reality show contract negotiation, then act stunned when those partners decline to follow you into an endless war you started without a plan. And then the economic and strategic fallout is described not as a talking point, but as a chain reaction. The Strait of Hormuz, oil price shocks, disruption to allies, and a crisis that spreads outward because the region does not exist in a vacuum. Whether you agree with every rhetorical flourish or not, the central point is brutally simple. When you make war impulsively, you don't just risk soldiers' lives, you gamble with global stability and domestic costs that land on families who didn't sign up to bankroll your ego trip. If the administration can't describe the why to the American people, if it can't explain the end state, if it can't even convincingly show it understands the operational risks, then what you have isn't strategy. It's a tantrum with missiles. One of the most revealing moments in the transcript is what happens when the conversation moves from policy consequences to moral character. The question about Trump fundraising off a dignified transfer isn't just a gotcha. It's a test of whether the basic civic norms still exist. A dignified transfer is supposed to be the sober ritual where the country acknowledges the human cost of war. In the account given here, Trump is described as refusing to remove a campaign hat, posing for photographs in front of flag-draped coffins, and then using those images to raise money. That isn't merely tacky. It's the conversion of sacrifice into content. It's the presidency as grift. And when a MAGA Republican's response is essentially, I haven't seen that, I don't know, it isn't exculpatory, it's diagnostic. This is what complicity looks like in the Trump era. Selective blindness as a survival skill. Notice how that dynamic keeps repeating. MAGA lawmakers aren't depicted as mounting a serious defense of the war's rationale. They're portrayed as evading, dodging, minimizing, or pretending they're unfamiliar with things that are plainly part of the public record in the moment. That is not normal party discipline. That is a political movement trained to treat accountability as optional, so long as the leader's base remains entertained. And in that environment, Democrats aren't just arguing a policy preference. They're trying to reassert the premise that in a republic, war is not supposed to be a president's personal brand extension. The transcript also introduces a highly charged element, the question of Israel's role and Netanyahu's influence. Here, the rhetoric sharpens in a way that demands care, because critiques of a foreign government's leadership and strategy are legitimate, and so are concerns about anti-Semitic dog whistles that can sometimes infest public discourse. The best reading of what the Democratic lawmakers are doing here is a pointed critique of decision-making and influence, arguing that U.S. foreign policy must be anchored in the interests of the American people, not the political needs of any foreign leader. And that Trump is uniquely manipulable by strongmen who understand how to flatter him, pressure him, and weaponize his craving for praise. That is entirely consistent with what we've watched for years. Trump treating foreign policy less like a system of national interests and more like a revolving door of personal vendettas, crushes, and grudges. And it's not an accident that this critique is paired with the NATO point. Trump's worldview isn't America first in any coherent strategic sense. It's Trump first. He insults allies because it thrills his base and feeds his image as a domineering strongman. Then, when he needs help cleaning up the mess he made, he acts offended that the world doesn't treat his demands as a commandment. That's not strength. That's petulance with nuclear codes. Perhaps the most damning section is the contrast between the enormity of what's happening and the triviality of Trump's performance. While the situation escalates, the transcript depicts Trump preoccupied with promoting his golf properties and basking in the glow of self-importance, talking about an Irish Open at a Trump-owned property, insisting he has nothing to do with it, while simultaneously boasting about owning it and taking credit for it. The point here isn't the golf tournament. The point is the always-on conflict of interest, the compulsive monetization, the inability to separate public duty from private profit, and the astonishing fact that this behavior persists even when lives are at stake. It's the same Trump pattern. Crisis is backdrop, Trump is the main character. Then you get the line that should make anyone's stomach turn if they're paying attention. Trump declaring the war is proceeding very strongly, boasting about knocking the hell out of them, framing it like a macho video clip rather than a geopolitical firestorm with civilians and troops trapped inside it. There's a reason lawmakers call it deranged. It's not just the words. It's the posture. It's the performance of dominance as a substitute for coherent leadership. And when that's paired with claims about timelines and weapons in a way that sounds more like salesmanship than verified public justification, you can hear why Democrats keep returning to the idea that the American people were never given a real explanation. In a democracy, the burden of proof for war is supposed to be heavy. In Trump's hands, it becomes casual. What makes this entire episode politically explosive is that it collapses multiple Trump failures into one frame. There's the constitutional failure, treating war-making like a unilateral executive thrill ride. There's the diplomatic failure, alienating allies and then demanding loyalty as if alliances were a feudal oath. There's the competence failure, placing people in critical roles who appear unable to do the job and then covering the void with bravado. There's the moral failure, using national sacrifice as fundraising fodder. And there's the corruption failure, conducting a presidency that constantly drifts back towards self-promotion and private advantage, even during war. And here's the part MAGA doesn't want said plainly. This isn't just about one bad decision. It's about a political movement that has trained itself to accept this as normal. The Republican Party that once pretended to care about troop honor, fiscal restraint, and constitutional process now, in this telling, responds to an allegation as grave as fundraising off a dignified transfer with, "I haven't seen that." That's not ignorance. It's permission. It's a signal to Trump that the boundaries are gone, that there is no behavior so grotesque it will trigger a real break from the people who depend on his base. Democrats, meanwhile, are doing what the opposition is supposed to do in a constitutional system, naming the pattern, documenting the harm, and demanding accountability. Calls to fire, impeach, investigate, those are not rhetorical decorations. They are attempts to reassert the idea that public office is not a costume party, and the Department of Defense is not a set for a Fox News cosplay audition. When members describe Hegseth as treating war like a video game, they're not just insulting him, they're warning that the administration is engaging in life and death decisions with the emotional maturity of people chasing likes. The final beat in the transcript gestures at something else. Cracks within MAGA itself, including talk of a high-profile resignation tied to opposition to the war. Even if you set aside the specifics and focus on the broader implication, it highlights an uncomfortable truth for Trump's coalition. The movement sells itself as anti-interventionist when convenient, but it repeatedly drifts toward militarized chaos when Trump wants to look tough. That contradiction doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and when the costs become visible, when coffins, inflation, supply shocks, and isolation are no longer theoretical, some portion of that coalition starts looking for the exit. This is why the Capitol Hill takedown matters. Not because Democrats delivered a few viral zingers, but because the transcript captures something more consequential. A portrait of leadership failure so comprehensive that it reaches beyond ideology. It's competence versus incompetence, democracy versus impulsive personal rule, public service versus private grift. If Republicans want to defend Trump's war, they can try by offering a coherent justification, a defined end state, a lawful process, and a strategy that doesn't rely on allies being bullied into compliance. But what the transcript shows instead is evasion, denial, and a president who treats the world like a stage and tragedy like a fundraising opportunity. That's the scandal. That's the story.